Male patient from Latur, known case of hypertension, diabetes, osteoarthritis, dyslipidemia, gastroesophageal reflux disorder. This patient was posted for laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy on 10th May 2022. So, patient was on regular telecommunication with surgeon and had lost 25 kg weight before coming to the hospital and was on respiratory rehabilitation measures. Also, patient was on treatment for lower limb cellulitis with the physician since last 1 month. Patient was suffering from breathlessness or exhaustion since last 6 to 7 months, which was aggravated since last 2 months. There was complaint of severe backache, also difficulty in movements across hip joint, especially in changing position from sitting to standing and reverse, but could walk with some difficulty. Presence of bilateral lower limb cellulitis below knee since March 2022. Patient had history of COVID-19 infection in 2021, for which patient was home quarantined, and also patient had completed 2 doses of COVID vaccination. In the past, patient had also undergone total hip replacement for right side in 2009 and for left side in 2018. In preoperative evaluation, 1 day prior to surgery, it was found that patient was conscious, cooperative, febrile, vitals were stable, CVS, RS, CNS examination were normal. Weight of patient was 137 kg, height was 167 cm, and body mass index was 49.12 kg per meter square. Labs were normal. Everything is CBC, LFT, RFT, coagulation profile were normal, and COVID RT-PCR and serology reports were negative. ECG showing sinus tachycardia, biphasic P wave in V1, T wave inversion in V1 to V6 and 2-3 AVF. Chest X-ray shows flattened diaphragm, rest within normal limit. 2D echo suggests ejection fraction of 60%, mild pH with pulmonary artery systolic pressure of 45 mm of mercury. ABG was done on room air, which shows pH of 7.4, PO2 was 60, PCO2 was 49, and bicarb was 31. In April 2022, patient had also bilateral lower limb venous Doppler and arterial Doppler. In venous Doppler, there was varicosities with incompetent perforators in left lower limb, and there was no evidence of deep vein thrombosis. In bilateral lower limb arterial Doppler, there was diffuse subcutaneous edema seen in bilateral lower limbs. Patient on medication antihypertensive OHA, as well as he was receiving tablet Orlistat, tablet Lacilactone, and tablet Clobitap A150, which was stopped 7 days prior to the surgery. There was no history of allergy to any of the medication. In airway examination, MPC was to mouth opening was more than 2 fingers. There was a large pad of fat below chin was present, and neck circumference was 44 cm. In OHA grade 3 and stop bank score was 8. So on the day 1, in the morning on the day of surgery, patient was shifted from ward to preoperative room. Patient's vitals were stable and saturation was 90% on room air, with patient in sitting position. So patient was pre-medicated with injection ondansetron and pantoprazole was given. Also injection liquid lignocaine 100 mg and injection magnesium sulfate 2 gram, which was added in 1 gram injection paracetamol, and this infusion was given over 15 minutes. It was observed that after 15 minutes that the patient was lying down flat on bed in preoperative room. Patient was drowsy with rapid shallow breathing. Okay. Saturation was 45% on room air. Heart rate was 100 per minute. BP was 100/70, and sugar was checked, it was 126. So patient was aroused and made to sit and O2 supplementation with 8 to 10 liter using Hudson's fast start test. So the patient's cerebration improved with it. Saturation improved up to 95 to 96% on O2 mass at 8 to 10 liter per minute. Then post this episode, patient was monitored in the pre-op room for 1.5 hours. Then the patient was seen by the physician and patient conditions were discussed with the surgeon, and then surgery was postponed for the time being. The patient shifted to high dependency unit with Hudson's mass. Chest X-ray was done, which shows planting of right costophrenic angle, so right set of pleural infusion. In In HDU at night, patient become tachypneic, desaturated up to 75% during sleep. Patient was arousable but preferred to sleep. So O2 supplementation we using O2 mask with reservoir bag at 12 liter per minute started. And saturation rises up to 85% with it. But there was persistent tachycardia and tachypnea. So the patient was shifted to ICU. Saturation was 82% with 12 liter flow. And but tachycardia and tachypnea still was there. On auscultation, bilateral fine crepitations were there. Patient was conscious, oriented, following command. So NIV started with 70% FiO2. At night around 3 am, patient became drowsy and exhausted. And vital level saturation was 86% on O2 mask with reservoir bag. Respiratory rate was 10 at that time. And EBG was done, we showed respiratory acidity feature. pH is 7.13 and PCO2 96. So the patient, we intubated the patient and we kept on the volume control mode with FiO2 of 100%. And also the right sided internal jugular vein cannulation was done with a triple lumen catheter. On day 2, patient was maintaining saturation of 95% with FiO2 of 70%. So 2D echo screening was also done, which was normal. Means no evidence of pulmonary embolism or no clot. Patient was taken in CPAP PSV support mode and saturation was 93%. In ICU, higher antibiotics, diuretics as well as supportive treatment were continued. Along with the nebulization with duolin and Budokard round the clock and this DVT prophylaxis, and patient was nursed in proctor position throughout ICU stay. At night, patient's BP dropped by up to 74 by 40 millimeter of mercury. So the fluid Goroska is given, but BP doesn't rise up. So injection adrenaline infusion was started. So BP rise up to 120 by 60 millimeter of mercury at noradrenaline infusion at 8 ml per hour. And patient saturation was 93%. So it was a query whether it's dehydration or sepsis. On day 3, patient was having low grade fever, D-dimer was raised, blood urea and creatinine were also raised, and there was resolving right-sided pleural infusion. And blood and urine culture were sent. So the patient, we gave the TP trial to the patient, and injection noradrenaline infusion was continued. But after 1 hour giving TP trial, patient was exhausted and he was kept on the CPAP PSV mode. One day also we tried to give the TP trial to the patient, but patient got exhausted again, so keep on the CPAP PSV mode. And on auscultation, bilateral fine crepitation were still present and there were persistent fever spikes. WBC count was on rising trend. CRP was 104 and D-dimer was 1340. Serum calcium and magnesium were low, so the correction was given. On day 5, we got the blood and urine culture reports which were negative, and we tapered the injection adrenaline support and it was stopped. Patient was maintaining BP of 140 by 88. Again the patient was given TP trial which he tolerated well with O2 at 6 liter per minute and saturation was maintaining 98%. On day 6, in the morning we have repeated the ABG on TPs and it was good. Bilateral ALT was clear, equal and clear. So we extubated the patient and electively kept on NIV. In the afternoon, from the NIV we shifted to patient to nasal forms and patient was maintaining good saturation of 92% and ABG was also good. On day 7, now after the 6 days of stay in ICU, on day 7 in the morning, patient was shifted to OT for the procedure. Patient was shifted with O2 with nasal pumps at 2 liter per minute. He was maintaining saturation of 92 to 93% in proctor position. Patient was taken in OT, proctor position, RAM position was given to the patient. Vitals were stable, saturation was 92% with nasal pumps. Right AGV triple lumen catheter was already in situ and functional. And one more 20 gauge IV cannula was secured in the right hand. Injection of ondansetron 4 mg IV was given. Antibiotics were given, preoxygenation was done and injection fentanyl 50 microgram IV was given. Then patient was induced with injection ketamine 30 mg IV, injection propofol 100 mg IV, mask ventilation was confirmed, and then injection cisplatin 14 mg IV was given. Patient was intubated and kept on controlled ventilation mode. Gastric calibration tube was inserted. Patient maintained on O2 air desflurane with intermittent top-up injection cisacrarium. Along with the vitals monitoring, we monitored ATCO2 and temperature throughout the procedure. Post induction under the all aseptic condition, USG guided 4-quadrant tab block was given with injection bupropion 0.25% 15 ml plus injection dexamethasone 2 mg in each quadrant with 20 gauge spinal needle. Prior to the start of surgery, patient was secured to the OT table. DVT pump was applied to both the lower limbs. Patient was positioned in supine with open legs and in reverse tenderlobar position. Then injection paracetamol 1 gram IV, injection vitamin K 30 mg IV, injection hydrocortisone 100 mg IV, as well as injection calcium gluconate 10 ml in 500 ml NS was given slowly. Total 3 crystalloids were given during the procedure. Surgeon carried out the laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. Vital parameters were stable throughout the procedure. Then prior to extubation, injection deriphylline 2 ml in 100 ml NS IV was given slowly. Post procedure, leg separation and reverse tenderlobar position was undone and ramp position was given again. Patient reverse extubated once the patient was awake. Normal airway reflex generated good total volume and having normal tone and power. Surgery duration was total 3 hours. Blood loss was 50 ml, urine output was 200 ml. Post-procedure, patient's vitals were stable and maintaining saturation of 92 to 93% with nasal prongs at 4 liters per minute. Patient was monitored in recovery for 3 hours and later shifted to ICU. Patient had adequate pain relief for 12 hours post-procedure. Visual analog scale score was 1 to 2 by 10. Later the analgesia was maintained with the IV analgesics. Patient was maintaining saturation of 95 to 95% on O2 at 2 liters with nasal prongs and 90 to 91% on room air. Post-operative stay of the patient was uneventful and patient was ambulated. Antibiotics, chest physiotherapy, in-situ spirometry were continued. Patient was discharged on post-operative day 3 with rehabilitative advice. On the post-operative 10th day, patient came walking for suture removal. Thank you.
Thank you, Amol. May I call Joy now for the next talk about the preoperative considerations in the morbidly obese patient. And I don't think really Joy needs any introduction because I think at the end he's also going to tell you about his candidature for the National Secretary's post. And you can see many achievements there, but I would just like to tell you that he is one anesthetist who's been actively participating in all 4 organ transplants like kidney, liver and uterus also. So
thank you one and all. Welcome you all on behalf of the Department of Anesthesia, KIM Hospital. I welcome you for this presentation on obesity. I thank ISA President Dr. Pradnya Balarao, and of course Sandeep is there. He is also the President of Obesity Anesthesia Society. Right, Sandeep? Yeah. So we have Rashmi, we have Sandeep, and I don't know how many else also practicing obesity surgeries. So this is a very nice presentation, and I'm going to talk about the preoperative evaluation. So not only about the preoperative evaluation, but also the preparation, not only of the patient, but of the hospital, OT, pre-op room, post-op room, all these things will come in this preoperative preparation for morbidly obese patients. So I will be covering the preoperative part and Rashmi will be covering the anesthetic part. So definition of obesity, it is defined as a disease because of its physiological dysfunction of human organism influenced by environmental, genetic and endocrine etiologies. food calorie intake exceeds the energy expenditure. BMI, that is body mass index, is widely used as a classification tool. So WHO has classified obesity as per BMI. BMI is body weight in kilograms divided by height of patient in meter square. So as per the WHO classification, you can see from underweight is less than 18.5 to obesity 3, that is more than 40. And but this BMI has some flaws. So it is not a perfect formula, because BMI can be high in bodybuilders who do bodybuilding, who have a high percentage of lean body mass, and it also is cannot correlate with the high ratio of adipose tissue. So we have to correlate the waist circumference along with the BMI. So that is the waist circumference in males less than 102 and in females less than 88. Then the risk is a little less. But if the waist circumference is more than 102 in males and more than 88 in females, then of course the risk is high. So you have to correlate the waist circumference along with the body mass index. What is central obesity? Central obesity is defined as the waist circumference greater than 88 in females and 102 centimeters in males, or the waist to height ratio greater than 0.55. So central obese patients are described as apple-shaped, whereas a predominantly peripheral fat is pear-shaped, more commonly seen in the female patients. Then we'll discuss something what is a metabolic syndrome. Now usually the thing has changed from obesity to metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome is a clustering of metabolic and physiological or physical abnormalities. So it contains, these are the clinical criteria: abdominal obesity, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, blood pressure and fasting sugar. So the features associated with metabolic syndrome are abdominal obesity, dyslipidemia, elevated blood pressure, insulin resistance, pro-inflammatory state, pro-thrombotic state. So amongst all these features, if there are 3 out of the 5, this meets the criteria for a metabolic syndrome. Now some useful terms regarding the patient's weight. So I am talking absolutely practical. Most of the things are given in book, more practical. So what is ideal body weight? What is total body weight? The total body weight is actual body weight in kilograms. Ideal body weight is calculated by height in centimeters minus x. X means in 100 in males and 105 in females. Lean body weight, it is the patient's body weight excluding the fat. That means it includes the muscle mass, bone, skin and the internal organs. So lean body weight is rarely exceeds 100 kilograms in males and 70 kilograms in females. Now these formulas are used when Rashmi will talk about the drug dosing, IV fluids, all and etc. So these are the 2 formulas. Of course, these formulas will be shown also by Rashmi. Then comes the adjusted body weight. This is a busy slide. Just see the last line, adjusted body weight. This takes into account the obese individuals have increased lean body mass and increased volume of distribution for the drugs. So how to calculate the adjusted body weight? Ideal body weight plus 0.4 into bracket total body weight minus the ideal body weight. These all will be again discussed later on. Now in an obese patient or morbidly obese patient, this obesity affects all the organs of the body, all the systems of the body. So while evaluating, you must concentrate on all the organs, just not heart, lungs, all the organs, including the skin, bones, everything has to be involved. So the first system is the cardiovascular system. So it's the systemic hypertension. This is because of hyperinsulinemia. Hyperinsulinemia stimulates or activates the renin-angiotensin system, increases circulating levels of epinephrine and non-epinephrine, increased tubular reabsorption of sodium and calcium, leading to hypervolemia and increased arterial wall stiffness. There is an increase in the cardiac output by 100 ml per minute for each 1 kilo of adipose tissue weight gain. Also, because of this hypertension, there is development of concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. These patients are also at the risk of coronary artery disease, so you have to be careful. So evaluate for most commonly seen in central obesity, evaluate for dyslipidemia, chronic inflammatory state, hypertension, diabetes. This also leads to atherosclerosis and therefore coronary artery disease. These patients can also have chronic heart failure because of volume overload, vascular stiffness, left ventricular diastolic dysfunction, right ventricular overload because of increased pulmonary arterial pressure, obesity-induced cardiomyopathy, and arrhythmias because of the fat infiltration in the conducting system of heart. There can be various arrhythmias. Then comes the endocrine system. You have to evaluate for glucose intolerance, diabetes mellitus, hypothyroid Cushing's. Gastrointestinal system. There can be non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. cholelithiasis leading to gallstones, and delayed gastric emptying time, delayed increase in the gastric fluid volumes, and of course dyspepsia. This may be indicate the presence of H. pylori infection. Obesity is in fact inflammatory syndrome, so there can be increased levels of inflammatory markers, cytokines, C-reactive proteins, interleukins, and there is a high rate of perioperative infection. So you have to maintain strict aseptic precautions throughout, especially while injecting drugs, giving IV drugs, and during the surgery. Musculoskeletal system is also involved, bones, joints. There can be hyperemia, uricemia, and gout, and of course vitamin D deficiency. Also, you have to evaluate the nervous system, because due to diabetes, there can be autonomic neuropathy. Deficiency of B12, thiamine, folate can also lead to autonomic dysfunctions. There can be pressure sores, nerve injuries because of the position and the heavy weight, and of course increase in incidence of stroke. Then thromboembolic disorders also have to be evaluated. There is a compounded effect of polycythemia, increased intraabdominal pressure, increased fibrinogen levels, decreased fibrolysis, immobilization leading to venous stasis, and increased risk of stroke and deep vein thrombosis. Then the next system which we have to evaluate and you have to keep in mind is the respiratory system. So in the lung volumes, restrictive pattern of ventilation, decrease FRC, decrease in the expiratory reserve volume and total lung capacity, ventilation perfusion mismatch, and decrease oxygen reserve. Gas exchange and the work of working, there is an increase in the oxygen consumption, increase in carbon dioxide production, increase in the work of breathing, increase in minute ventilation. So all this will decrease the oxygen saturation. Lung compliance is decreased and there is increase in the airway pressure. So you have to all examining the patient and evaluating patient, you have to keep in mind. Next part is the most important. Of course, it can be asked as a full question for the postgraduate is obstructive sleep apnea, OSA. So what is the OSA? It is defined as a cessation of breathing for longer than 10 seconds during sleep. Apnea occurs when there is pharyngeal airway collapse. So this OSA induces some physiological changes in the body. So what are these physiological changes? Arterial hypoxia, arterial hypercarbia leading to morning headache, polycythemia, systemic hypertension, pulmonary hypertension, right ventricular failure, daytime somnolence, and memory problems. OSA is usually diagnosed by using polysomnography or the sleep test in the sleep lab. The severity of the OSA is by the average number of incidences per hour. Sleep apnea syndrome is also when the OSA the incidence is more than 5 incidences per hour, so it is very severe. Then comes what is hypopnea or obstructive sleep hypopnea. It is the reduction in the size or the number of breaths compared to the normal ventilation and is associated with some degree of arterial desaturation. So while reading a sleep test or a polysomnography, how do you read it? They will read it as AHI, Apnea Hypopnea Index. AHI derived from the total number of apneas and hypopneas divided by the total sleep time. So the severity of OSA will depend, is classified as AHI events per hour. So 5 to 10 is normal limits, more than 30 is the severe disease. Now some points regarding Pickwick syndrome. This can be asked as a short note or a full question. Just in short, it is given in all textbooks. So Pickwick syndrome is a long-term consequence of OSA. It is called as obesity. Let's change the slide. Obesity hypoventilation syndrome. It is characterized by nocturnal episodes of central apnea, apnea without respiratory efforts because progressive desensitization of the respiratory center to hypercarbia. The features are obesity, daytime somnolence, arterial hypoxia, arterial hypercarbia, polycythemia, respiratory acidosis, pulmonary hypertension, and right ventricular failure. So these are the patients who are at high risk and can lead to respiratory arrest and right ventricular failure in the perioperative period. So these can be treated by giving nocturnal CPAP for treatment of this Pickwick syndrome. So now comes the preoperative evaluation. So you have to evaluate the patient in complete. So respiratory system is the first, airway assessment, cardiovascular system, endocrine system, and the venous system. So history taking, clinical examination, investigations, pre-op preparation of the patient, pre-op preparation of your operation theatre, pre-op preparation of your paramedical staff is all very important. So while taking the history, usually these patients have a sedentary lifestyle. So you have to take the history not only from the patient but also from the near relatives who will give the history, because if he's sleeping, who knows who's snoring? You can't say I'm snoring. This history has to be elicited by the relatives. So if there is history of chest pain, shortness of breath even at rest or minimal exertion, palpitation, comfortable position of sleeping, this has to be asked to the relatives. If there is exertional dyspnea, sorry I changed the slide. If there is exertional dyspnea, fatigue and syncope, that means there is signs or symptoms of pulmonary hypertension. So if there is exertional dyspnea, fatigue and syncope, think about pulmonary hypertension. If there is snoring, apneic episodes during snoring, daytime somnolence and morning headache, think of OSA. There can be acid reflux, heartburns, associated diseases like hypertension, diabetic, ISD, stroke, history of DVT. If there is history of painful coughs, claudication and previous history of some thrombosis in the legs, think of DVT. Plus, of course, you take the routine examination of all the systems of the body, including the orthopedic system, the skeletal system, the skin, everything. Then detailed clinical examination. Next slide. Routine clinical examination, as you see, but you have to specifically calculate the BMI, waist circumference and waist to hip ratio, height ratio, measure the arm circumference, because you are going to put larger side BP cuff. So measure the arm and what type of BP cuff will fit. Also measure the circumference of the thigh and cuff, because you will be ordering for the sleeves for sequential compression device. If the circumference of the thigh and the calf is big, so larger size sleeves has to be ordered. Look out for IV venous access, see for venous access, and if they are not good and not very easily accessible, take consent and ask and counsel the patient that you might have to need internal jugular in the OT. So proper consent and preparation of the patient for IGV has to be taken. Airway assessment then, while assessing the airway, patient has to be upright, sitting, facing you. See the fat over the neck and cheek, short neck, large tongue, tonsil, pharynx fat, restricted mouth opening, limited cervical movements, mandibular movements, large size breast, increased neck circumference at the level of the thyroid cartilage, more than 60 centimeters, that means definite difficult laryngoscopy, use of Mallampati score, and the use of Lemon assessment test. Now, what is Lemon's assessment test? This score has a maximum of 10 points. It is calculated by assigning 1 point for each following Lemon's criteria. So L, look for externally, that is facial trauma, which I already said. Facial trauma, large incisors, beard, mustaches, facial fat, large tongue. E is evaluated. There is 3-3-2 rule. 3-2 rule is that 3 fingers between the 2 incisors, thyroid distance 3 fingers, thyroid mouth distance 2 fingers. Then M is Mallampati classification, should be more than 3. Obstruction, large epiglottis, tonsil, pharynx, and then N, there is a neck mobility. Higher the Lemon scores, higher incidences of difficult intubation. Always ask the patient after you examine face to face to lie down and then sleep and see again the airway again after he lies down. So this will give you the correct idea how much he is breathing, how difficult is the breathing, and what is the difficulty the patient is breathing while breathing. Then amongst the respiratory assessment, clinical examination, exercise tolerance, room air saturation. Now, when to do ABG? So, what are the requirements? If the saturation is less than 95%, if the forced vital capacity is less than 3 liters, or the forced expiratory volume is less than 1.5 liters, if the respiratory V is at rest and serum bicarbonates is more than 27. So, these are the indications to do an ABG while assessing the patient. Then to screen the sleep disorder breathing, that is how to screen the OSA, we have to ask a questionnaire called as a stop bank. You can get a short note, what is stop bank? So what is the stop bank? It is a synonym. S is for snoring, do you snore loudly? T is for tiredness, do you feel tired, fatigue, sleepy during the daytime? O is observed, somebody else, a relative has observed that you have stopped breathing or there is choking or gasping during sleep. P is for blood pressure, high blood pressure. B is for high BMI more than 35, A is for age more than 50, N is for neck circumference around the Adam's apple more than 43 and more than 41 centimeters in females, and last G is for gender, that is male. Stop bank score has shown a very good correlation and good validity and is followed all over the world for assessing the severity of post-operative apneas. So if the score is more than 5, patient should be referred to a sleep physician and do a polysomnography and refer for treatment in the pre-operative phase itself. Then how to assess the cardiovascular system. So of course, clinical examinations, heart sounds may not be very easy to hear because of the large chest and the huge fat. If there are features of metabolic syndrome which we have discussed previously, then there is a strong association of cardiac mortality and morbidity. Cardiopulmonary testing may not be possible in all patients because the huge portion they not be able to walk on the stress on the treadmill and all or climb stairs. Depending on this, you can go for 2D echo. Sometimes 2D echo the echo window may not be good. You can go for stress test, which may not be possible. You can do a transesophageal echocardiography. That depends on the size of the morbidity or morbid obese patients, or a dobutamine stress test if there are there is more needed for cardiovascular evaluation. Of course, then the clinical evaluation of other systems has to be done, like the central nervous system, rule out neuropathies, bones and joints, and of course skin. So depending upon the evaluation, you have to do a mortality or morbidity risk scale, which is known as a stratification score. So obesity surgery mortality risk stratification score is very important. Risk factors are BMI more than 50, male, age more than 45, hypertension. Risk factors for pulmonary embolism are DVT, vena cava filters, sleep disorder breathing, and pulmonary hypertension. Depending on that, they are classified into class A, B, and C. So class A, the mortality score is less, whereas class C, mortality is between 2.5 to 3%, which is very high. After this, we do the preoperative investigations. Hematological with hematocrit, biological, renal function, liver function, blood sugar, which HbA1c, endocrine, thyroid function, coagulation profile, lipid profile, all those we all know. Imaging, X-ray chest to rule out heart failure, increased by bronchovascular markings, pulmonary congestion, pulmonary hypertension. USG abdomen, 2D echo, if not possible, go in for a transesophageal echocardiogram, and the venous Doppler of the legs to rule out any thrombus in the legs, abdomen, and pelvis. ECG is must. ECG is must to rule out right ventricular failure and left ventricular failure and evidence of any arrhythmias. Polysomnography depends upon if the patient has OSA, and PFT and ABG should be done if OSA is needing CPAP as a treatment. Then comes the preparation of the patient. So continue all the medications for the medical conditions is there, and if the surgery is not an emergency surgery, we are not talking about just sleeve gastrectomies or obesity surgery. Such a obese patient coming for non-obese surgery. So if the surgery is not emergency or is elective, then ask the patient if he is smoking to stop smoking and alcohol. Start exercising, maybe nebulization and spirometry will be enough. Liver diet to decrease the size of the liver. This diet is a fat-free and carbohydrate-less semi-solid diet, contains of vegetables and fruit pulps, and CPAP machine during the C. The other important point is that when the patient gets admitted in the hospital should provide proper size clothes to the patient. This is to maintain the dignity of the patient. Patient comes in the hospital, there is no proper size of the clothes, he is draped around by some bed sheet. This is not to be done. If you are going to have patients in your hospital, you should have proper size of the clothes. This is to maintain the patient's dignity. Whether it is for the obesity surgeries or even non-obese patients. Some patient may come obese patient for non-obese surgery. So the dignity of the patient has to be maintained. Preparation of the OT staff, personals, and the post-op recovery. So a WHO checklist has to be done. Get difficulty airway cart ready. Ensure that your operation theatre table can withstand that weight of the patient. So those OT table specifications are there that it can withstand 125 kilos, 250 kilos. Depending on that, you must, otherwise sometimes the patient is weighing 180 kilos and the patient's table is only 125. The table can break during the surgery. Ensure a long length of the surgical instruments. The patient is undergoing a lap cholecystectomy and the surgical instruments are for normal patients. So ensure that, so after anesthesia now there are no equipment. This has happened. Extra OT personals for helping, for transferring patient from trolley to OT table and from OT table to the shifting trolley. So extra personals are helping hand. If the patient is in the pre-operative room, the pre-op bed should have a proper position. So proper equipment for shifting and trolleys should be there, and the trolley should also maintain the weight of the patient. Ensure that the hospital is equipped to handle such obese patient. Otherwise, it is better to shift to a center which can provide all these facilities. Now, drug dosing and all, I will not go into detail. Rashmi will calculate things, will go into detail while anesthesia. Just 1, 2 or 3 points. Lipophilic drugs have a larger volume of distribution than hydrophilic drugs. Lipophilic drugs as per total body weight, hydrophilic drugs as per ideal body weight. Now, these charts, Rashmi will be talking, just a trailer of Rashmi's lecture. So I can just go through it. IV fluid management, emergence, post-op analgesia, post-op care, shift from the recovery room to the ward. Thromboprophylaxis. This is where the preparation starts. All morbid patients should receive prevention of deep vein thrombosis, prophylaxis. So it should start from pre-operative evaluation, leg exercises, and of course post-op early mobilization. Mechanical compression device, that is sequential compression device, DVT stockings, antiplatelet drugs is the mainstay to prevent DVT in obese patients. IVC filters, of course, this is the history of IVC, deep vein thrombosis, and of course avoid dehydration. Then we have the HATS committee, which has the HATS propofol, that means a protocol. This, the use of low molecular weight heparin, so this is the chart depending upon the body weight to give low molecular weight heparin. It should be given 12 hours before surgery and 12 hours after the surgery. So thank you here for listening to the pre-operative preparation and evaluation. Next lecture is of course more interesting, how to give anesthesia. Welcome Rashmi.
So, as I told you, the third presentation will be by Dr. Rashmi Valimbe, who's done her DNB, and after that she's done a fellowship in bariatric anesthesia. And I think she's very active in our department as far as all the bariatric cases go. So you'll hear from her about all this.
Good evening, everybody. I'll be talking about anesthesia management of a morbidly obese patient coming from any surgery. To start, let me thank SAP for giving me this opportunity. This is already talked about by Joy sir. According to ICMR survey, before COVID-19, the incidence of obesity was up to 36.3%. Now, after COVID pandemic, it has suddenly rose to more than 40.3% in general public. So it is a very critical issue. We have already discussed about the prerequisites. The hospital and the OR preparation is very important. Pre-op evaluation and optimization of a patient coming for elective surgery is also already we discussed. In the OT, we should have trained personnel. The anesthesiologist conducting anesthesia should be trained in handling obese patients, and if not, then you should always call for help. And ultrasound, I think, is a must nowadays for handling any obese patient. All these patients are high risk. More than 30 BMI, the patient becomes ASA grade 2 without any other comorbidities, and more than 40 BMI, the patient becomes ASA grade 3 without any other comorbidities. So all these patients are high risk. These patients come for elective surgery, so and most of them are not aware about their illness. They usually come thinking that they have come for a cosmetic surgery just to reduce their weights. So the acceptability of complications is very low. So we have to counsel the patient that they may have a lot of complications in the perioperative period for which they need to be optimized preoperatively. Again, you have to explain to them that they might need post-operative ICU stay and even ventilation in some patients. Our anesthesia goals are normotensive anesthesia. There is no role for hypotensive anesthesia in laparoscopy and obesity surgeries. The patient should be completely awake and coherent post-operatively. There should be no residual neuromuscular blockade, and patient should be absolutely pain-free for him to breathe properly. We have to consider while inducing the patient whether we can extubate the patient post-operatively. Secondly, what all regional anesthesia techniques we can give. We have to first counsel the patient about regional anesthesia. Then, okay, the patient may be ready for regional anesthesia. If the patient is posted for hysterectomy, we may counsel him for spinal anesthesia, epidural and whatever. But then the patient may say, okay, doctor, you can give me spinal and all. but then you have to carry out my surgery in sitting position because I cannot lie down. I am unable to lie down. Then what do you do? How do you go ahead? So you have to consider the position of the patient in which the patient should be comfortable, and if the patient cannot lie down, then you have to consider GA, because then we don't have any other option. So either GA versus regional, or we have to give GA plus regional. How do we pre-medicate the patient? All these patients have GERD, so these patients have to be pre-medicated with antiemetics, gastric acid prophylaxis, then bronchodilator nebulization can be given. If the patient is on antihypertensives, continue, except for telmisartan and ARBs. Deep venous thrombosis prophylaxis should be given to all patients. Omit antidiabetic medications if in the morning of surgery, and give use short-acting insulins according to the blood sugar levels. All other routine medications which the patient takes, like the patient may be hypothyroid, so he might be on thyroxine or antidepressants or any other medicines, should be continued perioperatively. If the patient is a smoker or asthmatic, then steroids can be given. How do we prepare the patient for OT? 2 good IV lines, at least 20 gauge, are compulsory. So if we cannot see the veins of the patient properly, then we can use the infrared light IV guides which are available nowadays. Or in some patients, even I have used USG guidance for taking peripheral vein. Then airway card should be available at all times in the OT. RAM position is preferred for inducing the patient. I'll come to it in the next slide. All emergency drugs and equipment should be kept ready in the OT. Anesthesia workstation should have a pressure controlled mode. TED stockings and calf compression devices should be present in the OT, and a patient warmer should be present. Now this is the airway card wherein we have the nasopharyngeal airway is a very important thing for induction of a morbidly obese patient. Different sizes of IGLs. Usually a patient will require smaller size IGL. Then we might think the patient's weight is 140, so we will use a 5 number IGL or LMA. But usually these patients take a LMA of size 4. We should use all monitors available with us. So if you have BIS monitoring and neuromuscular monitoring, it's well and good, but at least anesthesia gas monitoring, end-tidal CO2 and all other normal monitors should be there. Invasive monitoring should be used only in a selected few patients. In patients who are morbidly obese, in whom we cannot fit any BP cuff. In patients who have severe OSA, in whom we might need to take frequent arterial samples. In patients with moderate to severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. In patients with compromised left ventricular function, and in surgeries involving multi-compartmental fluid shifts, like in oncosurgeries. Central venous access should be taken only if peripheral venous access is not available. Coming to this patient had a conical arms. Many patients have such type of arms. So in this patient, it becomes very difficult to fit any BP cuff. No BP cuff will fit this patient. Normal will not fit. Extra large also will not fit. So in these patients, we can use a normal cuff on the forearm. It's a normal cuff. So we are tied to the forearm, and we can take the baseline BP as his preoperative BP as his baseline BP, and then titrate accordingly during anesthesia within 20% of his baseline BP. Coming to weight, so as the body weight increases, the lean body weight increases to some amount of level, but after that it plateaus, and whatever increases the fat weight goes on increasing after that. So in a normal patient, the lean weight is 80% and adipose tissue weight is 20%. Whereas in a obese patient, the lean weight is 60% and the adipose tissue weight will go on increasing further. So this is the table for drug dosing. So propofol we give according to the bolus can be given according to the lean body weight. Whereas if you are going to start an infusion, then it should be given according to the adjusted body weight. Rest all except for succinylcholine and neostigmine, all our drugs are given according to the lean body weight. And heparins, low molecular heparins and antibiotics are to be given according to the adjusted body weight. Adjusted body weight is lean body weight plus 40% of excess body weight. Coming to basic principles, so we should use regional anesthesia wherever possible if the patient can lie supine. Then we should use opioid sparing anesthesia, induction in RAM position, low volume, high rate ventilation with PEEP. We should use normotensive anesthesia, DVT prophylaxis is a must, and extubation in a propped up position when the patient is totally awake. So for opioid sparing, we can use multiple drugs which have different modes of action. Like we can use the combination of paracetamol, Maxelf and lignocaine. We can use NSAIDs. Induction should be done with using ketamine and propofol, and again regional anesthesia wherever possible. So coming to induction, again RAM position, ketamine co-induction. We should pre-oxygenate all patients. They have very less safe apnea time. The nasal airways are a boon. If the patient is not ventilated, you put in a nasal airway and the patient gets immediately well ventilated. And all supraglottic devices should be available. We have always been taught that confirm ventilation before relaxation. But in morbidly obese patients, most of the times we see is we give relaxant and then we are able to better ventilate the patient. Sometimes before relaxation we might not be able to ventilate the patient, but as soon as the patient relaxes, the ventilation immediately improves. This is a RAM position. So this patient the same patient is lying in supine position and this is a ramp. So you can see the difference. The airways open in the RAM position. The tragus and the Ziphisternum should lie in the same horizontal plane. If you don't have a ramp, then you can prepare a ramp using sheets and pillows. Or if nowadays even inflatable or silicone ramps are available. A two-hand holding mask technique is preferred because it is difficult to lift the jaw in this patient using only single hand. We should again keep all these things in mind as Dr. Joy has already explained. They have very much reduced safe apnea time. So we should use apneic oxygenation during laryngoscopy using either nasal prongs or nasal catheters, or nowadays if Thrive is available you can also use Thrive. Fasciculations with succinylcholine further increase oxygen consumption and they may further reduce the safe apnea time. So better induce with a non-depolarizing agent. Usually the tube size is same as any other normal adult, but sometimes if the patient is super obese, then you might require a smaller size, half size smaller tube. Ventilation always controlled. Even if the surgery is small, ventilation should always be controlled. Even if the patient comes for D&E and you want to give regional, you want to give the general anesthesia, the patient has to be on controlled ventilation. Again, low tidal volume, that is 6 to 8 ml per kg according to ideal body weight, and a high rate. A PEEP of 5 to 7 centimeters of water and peak airway pressure should be kept as far as possible to less than 35 centimeters of water. IE ratio preferred is 1:2 or 1:2.5 so that there is CO2 excretion. And patient should be maintained in the head up position throughout surgery. Coming to recruitment, so we start pre-operatively. If the patient is on CPAP, continue CPAP. During mask ventilation, apply PEEP. After we intubate the patient, we can give 5 to 6 vital capacity breaths with high PEEP and hold the breath for around 7 to 10 seconds, or alternatively put the patient on CFV mode. Put the respiratory rate to 4 and increase the PEEP to 40. Ventilate the patient like that for 1 minute and then come back to your normal ventilation with PEEP. Maintenance is with oxygen air inhalation and whatever inhalation agent we are going to use. nitrous oxide is usually avoided because these patients don't tolerate nitrous oxide. Many times they may become hypoxic. The saturation goes on dropping if you use nitrous, or the patient may have pulmonary arterial hypertension. In these cases, you better avoid nitrous. The inhalational agent can be used as either sevoflurane or desflurane, though desflurane is a better agent. We can use dexmedetomidine infusions because it provides analgesia, plus it keeps the cardiovascular system a little bit in check because it provides bradycardia. And the neuromuscular blocking agents use are etraquarium or cisatracurium because they provide better reversing conditions. And neuromuscular blockade is always reversed at the end of surgery. Comparing sevoflurane to desflurane is not very low. It has very low blood solubility and fat solubility, and it is not metabolized in the body. So it is excreted very fast, and patient awakens very well, and post-operatively patient is totally awake. So we prefer desflurane. If you use sevoflurane, we can do posting at the end of the surgery. So when the surgeon starts closing, with low flows you can shut off sevoflurane. So by the time the closure is over, the sevoflurane is almost washed out. All these patients have arthritis, they have spine problems, they have knee joint problems, hip joint problems. So they are very prone to compression fractures of the spine. In bariatric surgeries, they give a steep head-up position. So they may develop pressure on the spine because of the steep head-up. So they may develop compression fractures if not tied properly to the table. They should also have adequate padding to avoid injuries to the nerves and bony pressure points. Coming to regional anesthesia, if you want to practice landmark guided regional anesthesia, known landmarks are visible. So it is very difficult to give any blocks using landmark guidance. We require longer needles. Imaging is again difficult than normal patients, and you have to plan your ergonomics. Because ergonomics is very important in these patients. This is TAP block, which we routinely use for all laparoscopies nowadays in our hospital. Fat is a displaceable organ. So if you try to visualize anterior abdominal wall by a linear probe, without retracting the fat, you won't be able to see anything on the screen. So this is the technique. Somebody has to push the fat away from your probe, and then you can make out something on your screen. Also, they have lot of subcutaneous tissue, and many fibrous septa are there in the fat. So it is better to count your muscle layers from the peritoneum upwards, rather than going from skin to the peritoneum. The erector spinae block. Again, this patient is not morbidly obese, but now if you have a patient with this type of neck, coming for upper limb surgery, then it's almost impossible to give a landmark guided brachial plexus block. So in some cases, such patients, you have to have UAG guidance. In lower limb blocks come very handy. For all ortho cases, you can give general anesthesia with lower limb blocks. This is visualization of spine. Coming to fluid management. So unless there is a contraindications for giving fluids, you should give lots of fluids to these patients. They have high volume of distribution. So up to 10 to 15 ml of per kg of balanced distillate solutions can be given. And start the patients early with sips of water post-operatively. Sir has already mentioned about DVT prophylaxis. So we practice multimodal approach. We well hydrate the patient, we use TED stockings, sequential compression devices have to be started intraoperatively, and we mobilize the patient early. In our hospital, we mobilize the bariatric patients within 2 hours of surgery. So we mobilize in the recovery, and then we send the patient to the ward. Extubation again always reverse. Extubation is in the propped up position. The patient should be wide awake. Airway reflexes should be intact, and patient should be generating good tidal volumes at the end of surgery, at least 5 ml per kg. Keep again difficult airway cart ready at all times. And before extubating, put a nasopharyngeal airway. Or if you have put in a nasopharyngeal airway at induction, then don't remove it. Remove it afterwards. In the recovery, patient should always be nursed in a 45 degrees propped up position. Oxygen therapy till patient mobilizes, or oxygen therapy if patient needs. Patients, our goal of saturation should be to return the patient's saturation to his pre-op levels. So if the patient's pre-op saturation is somewhere around 90%, you don't aim the patient should have 98% saturation at the end of the surgery. His oxygen saturation should be around the same as pre-op levels. EtCO2 monitoring in the recovery, if you have, it should be used with the nasal. If you are giving oxygen with nasal prongs or a mask, then the EtCO2 nowadays it is available.
It is available.
It is available. So we can use EtCO2 monitoring in the recovery. We can use normal saline nebulizations because the patient has in bariatric surgeries, patient most of the times complain of lot of throat pain because the gastric calibration tube is many times manipulated. So we can give them normal saline nebulizations. The SCD pump should be continued post-operatively at least till 24 hours. Give good amount of IV fluids in the post-op period and mobilize as early as possible. Analgesics to be given round the clock. We should not wait for the patient to complain of pain. No opioids and no sedatives. Sips of water started as early as possible. We should continue antiemetics and gastric acid prophylaxis. BSL monitoring. If the patient is diabetic, and even if the patient is non-diabetic, at least we should do BSL once or twice in the early pre-op period, because after sleep or after bariatric surgeries, the patient have high chances of going into hypoglycemia sometimes. And so it's better to monitor blood sugar levels of these patients. Encourage the patient to walk at least every hour. And don't restrict the patients with urinary catheters, infusions and any other devices. These patients have to be really motivated for walking. Most of them are sedentary and they are obese because they don't walk or they don't exercise. So sometimes you really have to motivate them for walking post-operative. The commonest complication is respiratory failure, that is the hypercapnic variety, type 2 respiratory failure. But if you have optimized, if the patient is for elective surgery, then with good optimization, very few patients have respiratory failure. Most of the times, if the patient is coming for bariatric surgery, they have undergone some amount of weight loss before surgery. So usually they don't go into respiratory failure post-operatively. If there are any surgical complications, they are very difficult to assess. On palpation, you cannot palpate anything. Sometimes if you try to take the patient for imaging, nothing is available. On ultrasound, you don't see anything. We had one patient who did not fit into the CT scan machine. So that CT scan also was ruled out. So we had to take the patient for re-laparoscopy. So surgical complications keep a higher index of suspicion. Tachycardia sometimes may be the only sign. Tachycardia and excessive shoulder tip pain. That may be the only sign of surgical complication. And the most dreaded complication is rhabdomyolysis. If your patient comes for emergency surgery, then the patient should not be operated in small hospitals. Only hospitals who have trained personnel should take morbidly obese patients for emergency surgeries. The team should be experienced. The operative time should be minimized. The doctors treating the patient should have a high risk for high index of suspicion for complications, and good imaging facilities should be available at all times. The patient has undergone previous bariatric surgery and comes to you for some other surgery later on. Now the patient has lost a lot of weight. He is otherwise normal, but again, if he has undergone a sleeve gastrectomy, the patient may have a high risk of regurgitation. Then the patient may have multiple vitamin deficiencies. The patient has undergone a gastric bypass. Patient may have covert comorbid conditions which may aggravate in stressful times. The patient will say that I had diabetes, but now after my surgery I have not been using any OHA or any anti-diabetic medicine. But in stressful times, again this OHA, again this diabetes may revert. if you are inserting Ray's tubes or if you are doing endoscopies, then you should be very careful. Only trained personnel should attempt all these things, and you should not forcefully push anything. It may just perforate the stomach and go out. Patient may have anastomotic site ulcers or stenosis. Patient has undergone bariatric surgery last week, and now he comes with anastomotic site ulcers. Or after 1.5 months, he might come with anastomotic site stenosis. Then he may have again high risk for regurgitation, with all other risks of morbid obesity. Thank you all.